A black pilot lands a plane in a storm. But what happens next will shock you. He had just landed the plane. Saved over 200 lives. Proven, once again, that skill and preparation mattered more than prejudice. But the moment he stepped off that aircraft, everything changed. A security officer was waiting for him at the gate. Not for the captain, not for the crew, just for him. He was still in his uniform, his pilot wings gleaming on his chest. When the officer blocked his path, "We need to check something," the officer said, his voice firm. Passengers, the same ones who had just clapped for his landing, slowed in their steps. Some watched with confusion, others with knowing. "What's the issue?" Marcus asked, his voice even. The officer didn't answer. He just looked at him, scanning him up and down. Like he didn't belong. Like he hadn't just been the man in control of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Like he hadn't just guided them through a storm. Marcus had seen this before. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about security. It was about him. And then, just 7 minutes later, the officer was out of a job. What happened next stunned everyone and set off a chain of events that no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe, because these are the stories that must be told. It started like any other day, but it didn't end that way. The hum of the airplane engines was steady, constant, like the slow inhale and exhale of a sleeping giant. The cabin of Flight 2317 was wrapped in that peculiar hush that came after takeoff. When passengers settled into their routines, flipping through magazines, watching in-flight entertainment, or, like Marcus Chen, disappearing into the quiet sanctuary of a book. He sat in the middle rows, his tailored suit crisp, his posture composed. The weight of the world, as always, was balanced neatly between his shoulders. Though no one around him would know it, he had perfected the art of invisibility. Not through silence, no. His voice carried well when needed. And his words were always measured. Deliberate, rather. It was through something subtler. A way of moving. Of existing in spaces that had not been made for him. Without disturbing their order. A lifetime of learning when to look up and when to look away. Behind him, in the last 3 rows of economy, there was another kind of presence altogether. A group of bikers had claimed the space as their own. Their leather jackets stretched tight over thick arms. Their laughter loud, loose, and unburdened by the constraints of decorum. Their leader, Tank, he called himself, had arms like tree trunks and a voice that rattled the overhead compartments. They drank liberally, toasted themselves, and ignored the flight attendants' increasingly tight smiles. It did not take long before they noticed him. "Hey, businessman," one of them called, voice slurred at the edges. "Too important to say hello?" Marcus didn't look up. He had played this game before. He knew the rules. The others joined in, chuckling, nudging each other, making a show of it. A chorus of derision. Of something just shy of outright confrontation. The way men who have always belonged test the patience of those who have had to ask permission. Marcus kept his eyes on his book. The first jolt of turbulence came suddenly, knocking half-full cups from tray tables, sending murmurs of unease through the cabin. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and the flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, asking passengers to buckle in. Marcus closed his book, sliding it neatly into the seat pocket in front of him. He moved with purpose, his body sure against the shifting floor beneath him. Without a glance back, without so much as a second thought, he stood and walked toward the cockpit. The bikers fell silent. Tank's bravado faltered, if only for a second. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. A flight attendant, her patience worn thin but her professionalism intact, turned to answer. There was something almost like satisfaction in her voice as she said, "That would be our senior co-pilot." Silence settled over the back rows like a heavy fog. The weight of their assumption, their mistake, their quiet, ingrained prejudice pressed against them now. Undeniable. And yet, even as the revelation rippled through the cabin, even as Marcus stepped into the cockpit with the unshakable confidence of a man who had earned his place 1,000 times over, something lingered in the air. It was not just a surprise. It was not just embarrassment. It was the quiet, gnawing resentment of men who had spent their entire lives certain of the natural order of things, and had just been reminded that the world did not belong to them alone. It was the kind of resentment that did not fade, the kind that found new ways to express itself. And the night was still young. The air in the cabin had changed. It was not a thing that could be seen, nor even named outright, but Marcus knew it was there. It always was, like the way the wind shifts before a storm, or the way a room goes still before someone says something they can never take back. He had felt it before. This weight. It followed him into boardrooms and restaurants, into interviews and late-night gas stations. It existed in the spaces where doubt was polite and in the moments where it was not. It lived in the narrowing of eyes, in the too quick assumption that he was lost, in the question always hanging on the edge of a smile. Are you sure you're supposed to be here? And now, in the moments after he stepped into the cockpit, it took shape in the shifting postures of the men in the back rows, in the sudden absence of laughter, in the way Tank's jaw clenched as though it physically hurt him to be wrong. Marcus did not have time to think about them. He had a job to do. The turbulence was worsening. He took his seat next to Captain Rivera, strapping in as the plane shuddered again, its body groaning against the forces pressing in from all sides. The storm was moving faster than expected, its winds churning over the ocean below. This was not yet an emergency, but it was the kind of situation that could become one in an instant. "Towers advising we divert," Rivera said, his voice steady, though Marcus could hear the slight edge beneath it. "No margin for fuel," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the instruments. "We land at the destination. Or we don't land at all." Rivera gave him a sharp look. Not in challenge, but in understanding. They had flown together long enough to trust one another. But trust was a luxury not afforded to him by all. Behind the cockpit door, the voices of the bikers were rising again. Not in the boisterous, easy way of before, but in something quieter, tighter. "They let anyone fly these days," someone muttered. "No, you know what this is." Tank's voice, lower now, coiled with something ugly. "Diversity higher. Have you seen how these airlines operate? Filling quotas. You think they'd let him near that cockpit if it weren't for that?" The words were meant to be low. Meant to be just for the men who already agreed. Meant to coil inside their chests like a slow-burning fuse. But an elderly woman 2 rows ahead turned around. Her face calm but her eyes sharp. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you're saying," she said, her voice carrying just enough to silence them. Tank held her gaze for half a second before scoffing and looking away. Marcus, of course, did not hear this exchange. He had no need to. He had lived it. The plane lurched again, dropping suddenly before leveling out. Gasps rippled through the cabin, followed by uneasy murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rivera's voice came over the intercom. Smooth and controlled. "We're adjusting altitude to avoid the worst of the turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Marcus was already recalculating. The storm was pushing eastward. Unpredictable. He reached for the controls, his fingers moving instinctively. Adjustments made in real time. Behind them, Tank exhaled sharply. "You hear that? Adjusting altitude." He leaned forward, speaking louder now, just enough for those around him to hear. "Pilot doesn't know what he's doing." "Shut up, Tank," one of the younger bikers muttered. But Tank wasn't the kind of man to let go. He clung to his certainty, even as it crumbled in his hands. And Marcus, who had spent his entire life proving himself to men like this, knew exactly what was coming next. It always started as whispers. But it never stayed that way. The plane shuddered again, the turbulence growing more erratic, as if the sky itself had turned against them. In the cockpit, Marcus adjusted their course, scanning the instruments, his hands steady. Captain Rivera murmured something under his breath, but Marcus barely heard it. He was inside the numbers now, inside the delicate balance of altitude and wind speed, of fuel calculations and approach vectors. It was second nature to him. And yet, even in this moment, where the only thing that should have mattered was skill, he could feel it, the doubt. Not from the storm, not from Rivera, but from behind that door. Tank and his men were stewing in it, letting it harden into something heavier, something uglier. The thing about men like Tank was that they had spent their entire lives believing that the world operated in a certain way. That strength looked a certain way. That power belonged to men who resembled them, who carried themselves as they did, who spoke with the same voices, who walked into a room expecting the world to shift to accommodate them. And when it did not, when they encountered something that defied those rules, it wasn't just discomfort they felt. It was something closer to betrayal. Marcus had seen it before. A passenger who looked him up and down when he first entered the cockpit. Then immediately asked to speak to the real pilot. A senior colleague who once advised him, with a friendly hand on his shoulder, that he should consider sticking to short-haul flights because international routes demand a certain presence. A stranger who had leaned in too close at a dinner party, smiling as he asked, "But where are you really from?" It was not always spoken outright. Sometimes it was in the way someone's expression flickered for half a second before their smile set in place. Sometimes it was in the way their eyes hesitated on his name, as if it was an obstacle they had to navigate before deciding how to speak to him. Sometimes it was in the silence between words, in the pauses that held too much meaning. Now, in the back rows of the plane, Tank was filling that silence with something else. He was a man who understood control. He had spent his whole life establishing it, reinforcing it, and he knew, instinctively, that the best way to maintain power was not through brute force, but through the steady erosion of someone else's. "You ever notice," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "how these airlines never put guys like him in charge? Always second in command, never the real deal." The men around him grunted, some nodding, others too uneasy to speak. "But hey," Tank continued, his voice slick with something Marcus had heard 1,000 times before. "Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're in the safest hands possible." His tone made it clear that he did not believe this. That no matter what Marcus had done, no matter how many hours he had flown, how many storms he had navigated, how many lives he had carried safely through the sky, it would never be enough. Because the truth was, for men like Tank, Marcus's excellence was not proof of his skill. It was proof that something had gone wrong. That the world had shifted in a way that made them uncomfortable. That the ground beneath their feet was no longer as steady as they had once believed. The plane lurched again, harder this time, sending a drink cart skidding a few inches forward before a flight attendant caught it. A murmur of unease rippled through the cabin. Tank seized on it. "This turbulence normal?" he asked. Louder now, turning to the passengers around him. The woman across the aisle gave him a sharp look. "The pilot just said we're adjusting altitude." Tank smiled at her. "Too wide, too casual." "Oh, sure, just asking. You know, some of us like to know we're in good hands." His words dripped with the suggestion that they were not. And suddenly, the whisper of doubt that had existed only in the back row began to seep outward. Passengers who had not been paying attention before now looked up. A young couple exchanged nervous glances. An older man in the front section sat a little straighter, his fingers tightening around the armrest. Marcus, of course, could not hear any of this. He was too busy doing what he had been trained to do. In the cockpit, Rivera glanced at him, storms moving faster than expected. "I see it," Marcus said. His voice was even, measured, but his mind was already 3 steps ahead. "We'll need to adjust our approach plan. Keep a close eye on wind shear." Rivera nodded, already flipping switches, preparing for the necessary adjustments. They worked together seamlessly, the way trained professionals do. The way men do when there is trust. Behind them, in the cabin, the same could not be said. Tank leaned back in his seat, stretching, his smirk widening. He could feel it now. The shift, the doubt, spreading like ink in water. That was the thing about prejudice. It didn't always need to be shouted. Sometimes, all it needed was a whisper. And Marcus, though he had spent a lifetime outrunning those whispers, was about to find out just how loud they could become. Turbulence had a way of exposing things. It peeled back the veneer of control, revealing what lay beneath. Some people tightened their grips on the armrests. Some murmured prayers under their breath. Others tried to pretend they weren't afraid. Their smiles brittle, their laughter forced. And then there were men like Tank. Men who did not fear the storm so much as they feared the idea that someone else, someone they had already dismissed, was the one guiding them through it. Marcus had seen this before. Prejudice, when confronted with undeniable skill, did not disappear. It hardened. It dug in. It searched for new ways to justify itself. Now, in the uneasy hush of the cabin, Tank was doing exactly that. He could feel the shift in the air. The way people were listening now, even if they pretended not to. The way doubt, once planted, spreads like a weed. So what's the plan? He asked. His voice deliberately loud, cutting through the murmurs. Just ride this out and hope for the best? A few passengers looked toward the nearest flight attendant, who was making her way through the cabin, checking seat belts. Sir, she said, her voice measured. Please remain seated and keep your voice down. Tank ignored her, his focus on the people around him. I mean, I don't know about the rest of you, but I like knowing who's flying my plane. He let the words hang, their meaning obvious. Guess that makes me old-fashioned? It was an old trick. Not an outright accusation, just enough suggestion to let people come to their own conclusions. It worked. A woman in business attire shifted uncomfortably. A man 2 rows ahead frowned but said nothing. And then, from the front of the plane, an elderly man in a veteran's cap turned around. Son, his voice was gravelly, measured, and it carried through the cabin with an authority earned over decades. I flew in, Nam. Did a few combat drops in worse weather than this. And I'll tell you something about pilots. Good ones don't come in just one kind. There was a beat of silence. Tank smirked, but it was thinner now. Sure, I'm just saying. Quote, no, you're not. The veteran cut him off. You're not just saying. You're stirring the pot, and I suggest you stop before you make a fool of yourself. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A few heads nodded. The doubt that Tank had been so carefully spreading began to falter. But then the plane lurched. A violent jolt that sent a drink cart skidding into the aisle. And everything shifted again. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed. A flight attendant grabbed the nearest seat to steady herself. Marcus was already adjusting, his voice calm, clear. Crosswinds at 25 knots. Shifting east. Reducing speed by 10% to compensate. Rivera nodded. We may need a second course adjustment. Let's get clearance from ATC. They worked in tandem, their movements precise, methodical. But in the cabin, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the feeling of helplessness. The fear curling in the edges of people's minds. Looking for something, someone, to blame. And Tank saw his moment. This isn't normal, he said, shaking his head. Louder this time. This is what happens when you've got the wrong man in the cockpit. The words cut through the cabin like a blade. There it was. Not a whisper, not an insinuation, but the thing itself. Naked, undeniable. For a moment, silence. Then a young woman in a window seat. Jessica, a social media manager from Seattle, pulled out her phone and hit record. I think the whole plane should hear what you just said, she said, her voice steady. Tank's smirk flickered. I don't answer to some little girl with a phone, he said, dismissive, but there was something else beneath it now. A hesitation. Because the world had changed. Because once, a man like him could say a thing like that and let it sit in the air, unchallenged. But now, in this new world, there are consequences. And yet, even as he waved her off, even as Jessica held her phone up in quiet defiance, Marcus knew that the damage had already been done. Because doubt, once spoken aloud, did not disappear. It lodged itself in the corners of people's minds, waiting. And the storm outside was only getting worse. The plane rocked violently now, caught in the hands of something larger than itself. Marcus did not flinch. He had trained for this. Had spent thousands of hours learning how to read the sky. How to feel the way the plane responded beneath him. His hands moved instinctively, adjusting the altitude, recalculating descent speed. The storm was pressing in. Its winds unpredictable, its power undeniable. Still, he was calm. Because this was the job. Because this was what he had spent his entire life proving he could do. Yet behind him, beyond the cockpit door, the real turbulence was inside the cabin. Tank had spoken his piece. And now it sat there in the air, thick as the storm pressing against the fuselage. A few passengers had turned away, trying to ignore him, but others had let the words settle into the corners of their minds. Was this normal turbulence? Was the plane supposed to be shaking this much? Were they really in good hands? Marcus had heard it before. In different forms. In different places. Once, in a boardroom. When a senior executive had leaned back in his chair and said, "It's just that people feel more comfortable with a certain kind of leadership." Once, at an airport, when a passenger had asked him, with a thin smile, if he was the flight attendant or the engineer. Once, at 15 years old, when his guidance counselor had suggested that maybe aviation was too ambitious. That, people like you, often had better luck in other careers. And now, here, in this plane, as the sky raged around them, it was happening again. The words were always different, but the meaning was the same. Tank smirked, leaning back in his seat as if he had already won. "You all want to trust a guy like that up there?" he said. His voice carrying over the cabin. "Be my guest." He had not shouted. He had not needed to. Because racism, real racism, the kind that lasted, the kind that endured, was not always loud. Most of the time, it was quiet. It was a shadow in the corner of a room. It was a pause before someone answered. It was the way a woman in first class, a woman who had been perfectly comfortable minutes ago, was now gripping her seat just a little tighter. It was the way silence spread, thick and knowing. And yet, even then, even in the face of that silence, resistance still existed. Jessica, the woman with the phone, was still recording. The veteran in the cap had crossed his arms, watching Tank with something close to disgust. And now, an elderly woman, a retired nurse, her blue cardigan slightly askew from the turbulence, turned to face him. "Tell me something," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "When did you decide to be afraid?" Tank blinked. "Excuse me? You weren't worried when you got on this plane. You weren't scared when you were laughing with your friends. You weren't doubting the pilot when you were throwing back drinks." She tilted her head, studying him. "So I'm asking, when did you decide to be afraid?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Because that was the thing. Wasn't it? This wasn't about the turbulence. It wasn't even about fear. It was about something else. Something deeper. The plane shook again. Harder this time. And from the cockpit, Marcus's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We are adjusting course to find a smoother path through the system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are in control." He said it with a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that left no room for argument. But in the back row, Tank scoffed. He did not believe it. Not because it wasn't true, but because men like him had built their lives on the idea that men like Marcus could not possibly be in control. And that, more than the storm, more than the shaking plane, was what truly unsettled him. He opened his mouth to speak again. But before he could, the oxygen masks dropped. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as the yellow masks dangled from the ceiling, their elastic straps swaying with the motion of the plane. The turbulence had worsened. This was no longer just a storm. This was something else. And suddenly, all the doubt, all the whispers, all the smug certainty in Tank's face drained away, leaving only the raw, unmistakable truth. This plane was in the hands of the man he had spent the last hour trying to diminish. And there was not a damn thing he could do about it. The oxygen masks dangled like ghosts, swaying with each shudder of the aircraft. In the cockpit, Marcus was steady. His hands, his voice, his entire body knew what to do. He had trained for this. He had prepared for this. The plane had lost some cabin pressure, but they were still in control. He adjusted altitude, checking wind speeds, feeling the weight of the storm pressing against them. He was focused, but in the cabin, there was nothing but chaos. People gasped. Some fumbled for their masks, hands trembling. A mother reached for her child. A businessman cursed under his breath, eyes darting to the window, as if he could somehow see their fate written in the sky outside. And Tank was frozen. For the first time since this flight began, he had nothing to say. Because this was real now. This was no longer a game. No longer a chance to prove a point. To undermine. To belittle. This was no longer about who should or shouldn't be in the cockpit. This was about survival. And survival had a way of silencing men like him. The young biker beside him. Jimmy, the one with the Air Force t-shirt hidden beneath his leather jacket, was already pulling on his mask. His hands moving on instinct. His training kicking in. Tank, he said sharply, tugging at his sleeve, put the damn mask on. Tank didn't move. His face had changed. Because for all his bravado, for all his posturing, for all his smug little comments about whether Marcus belonged in the cockpit, he now realized that he had put his life in the hands of the very man he had dismissed. And there was no walking that back. There was no undoing it. He had built his entire life on the idea that men like Marcus weren't supposed to be in charge. And yet, here they were. Marcus, in control of the plane. Marcus, the only thing standing between them and catastrophe. Marcus, the difference between life and death. A lifetime of certainty cracked in an instant. Tank, Jimmy repeated, his voice sharper now. The mask. But Tank just sat there, chest rising and falling too fast. His pride warring with his fear. Because how could he admit it? How could he admit that the man he had spent the last hour ridiculing, questioning, undermining, was the very man he was now praying would keep him alive? It was too much. Too much to process. Too much to say out loud. And so he did what men like him always did. He doubled down. This, he started, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking. This is his fault. The words came out strangled. Desperate. But they were enough to turn heads. A businessman in the aisle seat frowned. What the hell are you talking about? Tank grasped onto the only thing he had left. The only way to keep himself from drowning in the truth. This wasn't happening before, he said, voice rising. We were fine before. We never should have let. The words barely escaped his lips before the elderly nurse cut him off. I told you to be careful about what you say, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. And now? I suggest you shut up before you embarrass yourself any further. Tank turned to her, breathing hard. You don't get it. Oh, I get it just fine, she said. You've spent this whole flight looking for someone to blame. And now, even as this man, this pilot, is saving your life, you still can't admit you were wrong. She shook her head. Men like you never can. A few passengers were nodding now, their fear turning into something else. Something close to anger. Tank could feel it. But before he could say anything, before he could regain control of the moment, the cockpit intercom crackled to life. Marcus's voice was there again. Steady, unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We have made adjustments to stabilize our descent and are working closely with air traffic control to ensure a safe landing. Please remain calm. We are in control. The cabin went still. Because no matter what Tank had said, no matter what he thought he knew, Marcus's voice carried something undeniable. Competence, authority, certainty, and suddenly, all of Tank's bluster, all of his muttered comments, all of his smug little smirks, they meant nothing. Because the only thing that mattered now was the truth. And the truth was that Marcus was the one keeping them safe. The truth was that this man, this pilot, this leader, had not let their doubts shake him. The truth was that Marcus had been steady while Tank had crumbled. And that truth, that unbearable, undeniable truth, was something Tank would have to live with. The plane steadied. Passengers breathed. A child clutched her mother's hand. And somewhere in the back row, a man who had spent his whole life believing that he was stronger than others, finally understood what real strength looked like. The storm was still there, still pressing in, but something else had shifted. The turbulence had become something more than physical now. Something deeper, something that was not caused by wind or altitude, but by the reckoning unfolding in the cabin. The truth, unspoken for so long, was now out in the open. And truth had a way of making people uncomfortable. Tank sat stiffly in his seat. His fists clenched. He had spent his whole life knowing who he was. A man who commanded attention. Who controlled his space. Who never had to question his place in the world. But now, for the first time, he wasn't in control. For the first time, people weren't listening to him. They were listening to Marcus. The pilot he had dismissed. The man he had ridiculed. The voice he had tried to drown out. And that voice, steady, composed, unshaken, was the only thing keeping them from falling out of the sky. It was unbearable. So he did what men like him always did when their world stopped making sense. He tried to take it back. "I don't trust this," he muttered, shaking his head. His voice was lower now, but still carrying. "We don't even know if he's qualified for this. You all just gonna sit here and put your lives in the hands of..." Quote. The words were cut off. Not by an argument, not by an interruption, but by something worse. By silence. A silence that stretched. A silence that was louder than any condemnation. Because no one was listening anymore. No one was engaging. No one was feeding the fire he had been stoking since takeoff. Tank looked around, waiting for someone to nod. To agree. To smirk alongside him. But there was nothing. The businessman who had once looked uncertain was now staring straight ahead. His expression unreadable. The elderly woman who had confronted him before was sitting with her hands folded in her lap. Calm and unmoved. The young biker beside him. Jimmy, the one who had followed him onto this plane. Who had always laughed at his jokes. Who had always had his back. Was looking at him like he was a stranger. Tank swallowed. His chest rising too fast. Too tight. Something was breaking. Not in the plane. Not in the storm outside. In him. The worst thing that could happen to a man like him wasn't being wrong. It was having no one left to agree with him. And now, as the plane leveled out, as the chaos began to settle, as the passengers began to trust what they had once doubted, he realized, too late, that he had lost. Not to Marcus. Not to the storm. But to himself. Because when the moment of crisis had come, when fear had gripped the cabin, when the masks had dropped, when the sky itself had seemed to turn against them, he had been the one who panicked. He had been the one who lost control. While the man he had spent this entire flight belittling had been the only one who remained calm. And now, as the lights flickered, as the first breaks in the storm appeared through the windows, as Marcus's voice filled the cabin one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now in stable conditions. Please remain seated as we prepare for our final descent." Tank felt something that he could not name. Something sharp and small and heavy all at once. Something dangerously close to shame. And for the first time in his life, he had no words to fight it. The sky had begun to clear. Through the cabin windows, slivers of sunlight broke through the dissipating storm, streaking across the clouds like fragile veins of gold. The worst of it was behind them now. The wind, the shaking, the drop in pressure. But inside the plane, the storm had not yet passed. It still clung to the air between the passengers. It was in the way people sat. Unnaturally stiff, as if trying to process something too big to put into words. It was in the way glances flickered toward the back row, toward the man who had spent the entire flight filling the space with doubt. Only to fall silent when doubt finally turned on him. Tank had not spoken again. He sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, his hands curled into fists on his thighs. His world had narrowed into something small and sharp. Something that had nothing to do with altitude or flight paths. And everything to do with the weight in his chest. No one had confronted him. No one had told him off. They didn't need to. The truth had already done the work. And now, as the plane began its final descent, as the ground came into view, as Marcus prepared to bring them home, the truth sat with him. Settled into his bones like an old wound reopening. Because this was never supposed to happen. Not like this. Men like him, men who had always been sure of their place in the world, were not supposed to be proven wrong so completely, so undeniably. And yet, here they were. And here was Marcus, his voice once again crackling over the intercom, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot. We are making our final approach. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." Tank exhaled slowly. Marcus's voice did not waver. Not once. Not when the storm had closed in around them. Not when the plane had trembled under its weight. Not when men like Tank had tried to strip him of the authority he had rightfully earned. And Tank had seen something then. Something he could not yet name. Something in the way Marcus had remained calm when everyone else had been afraid. Something in the way he had carried himself. Not with arrogance, not with defiance, but with certainty. It was the certainty of a man who had spent his entire life walking into rooms full of people who doubted him and proving them wrong without ever having to raise his voice. It was the certainty of a man who had never been given the luxury of failure. And now, as the plane descended smoothly toward the runway, as the ground rushed up to meet them, Tank realized, in the quiet part of his mind, that he would remember this flight for the rest of his life. Because in the end, it hadn't been the storm that shook him. It had been the realization that he had built his whole life on the idea that strength and competence looked a certain way. And then, in the moment of crisis, had watched a man he had underestimated embody both in a way he never could. The wheels touched down. The cabin let out a collective breath. A moment of stillness. Then, applause. It started in the front. A few hands clapping in relief. Then spread through the rows. Growing louder, fuller. It was not just for the landing. It was for something more. It was for the man in the cockpit who had been steady when everything else had been chaos. It was for the truth that had revealed itself, even to those who had spent their whole lives trying not to see it. Tank did not clap. He sat there, silent, his own hands still, his mind filled with 1,000 things he wanted to say but no longer had the right words for. Because the hardest part of being proven wrong wasn't just the shame of it. It was knowing that you could never go back to who you were before. The cabin lights flickered as the seatbelt sign went off. People stood, stretched, reached for their bags. Life moved forward, as it always did. The cockpit door opened. Marcus stepped out, standing tall in his uniform. His face unreadable, his presence unmistakable. Passengers turned as they walked past, offering nods, quiet words of gratitude. A businessman shook his hand. A mother mouthed, "Thank you." And Tank sat there, watching, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. He could say something now. He could force out some half-hearted joke, make light of it, try to reclaim some dignity. Or, he could sit in the truth of what had happened. He could let it change him. For the first time in his life, he had no control over which choice he would make. Because the world had already shifted. And now, for better or worse, he had to find a way to live in it. Marcus nodded once, at no one in particular, at everyone at once, then turned and walked toward the jet bridge. The storm had passed, but nothing would ever be the same.